All right, we're ready for chapters 9 through 11 of the book of Ezekiel. And we're going to see where we've been and where we're going. This is the outline that we're following, adapted from Baxter and Wearsby. And there are three major sections to this book. The first major section has to do with judgment on Jerusalem, remembering that Ezekiel is in the second group that went into captivity. And so he's talking about the time period from that second invasion, the second group to go into captivity, until that third final invasion when Jerusalem falls. And there were those false prophets who were saying in Jerusalem, and some among them in the captives as well, that Jerusalem would never fall. We're going to see more about that in our study tonight. But Jerusalem is going to fall, and so here's judgment on Jerusalem pronounced in chapters 1 to 24. And after the call to be a prophet, we saw the disobedient nation, and we're in this section here, the glory departs, 8 through 11. We looked at chapters 7 and 8 last time. And in chapter 8, if you want to back up and take a look at chapter 8 just briefly, that in this vision, and this is a vision that we're considering in our study tonight, that ends at the end of chapter 11. But be that as it may, this vision that is involved in this glory departing starts in chapter 8. And the vision took Ezekiel to Jerusalem to view the temple. Of course, in the vision, he's there, but not literally there. But to view the temple, and what he's allowed to see is all form of corruption and idolatry there. And he saw the idolatry. He saw the secret form of animal cult, the worship of false gods. He found them worshiping the sun. And so he found all forms of corruption, and thus the punishment is coming because of that. So that was in chapter 8. Now we're going to look at chapters 9 through 11. Here's what happens in 8 through 11. Four major points, and the part that's kind of shaded out we're going to get to in a moment, and you'll catch up on all of that. But the idolatry seen in the temple, chapter 8, well, what happens in chapter 9 is that the wicked are slaughtered while the righteous are spared. And there's some very practical things to learn from that, not only for them, but for us as well, that the righteous are going to be spared, but the wicked are going to be slaughtered. Punishment is coming because of this idolatry. We're going to see all of that in chapter 9. Two or three things happen in chapter 9. Chapter 10, we're going to see that the glory of the Lord departs from the temple. God has been saying that, and we'll go back and get this in chapter 8 before we get to chapter 10, that's me or the idols have to go, and so God's going to leave the temple and allow then the foreigner to come in and invade the temple. Then chapter 11, the threat of judgment and the promise of mercy. We're going to see one of the first promises that we've seen in this book concerning the restoration. Haven't seen that so far. We're going to see that in chapter 11 in just a few moments. So let's make our way through chapters 9, 10, and 11. Let's start with chapter 9 here. The wicked are slaughtered while the righteous are spared. Now I want to back up to chapter 8 just for a moment. I said we'd come back and catch this. Back at verse 6. We're in chapter 8 in verse 6. We made a point, and if you were not here, or if you were here and you didn't make a note of this, you may want to make a note of this to the side, and a marginal note, that verse 6 which says, "Furthermore he said to me, Son of man, do you see what is going on? A great abomination in the house of Israel commits here. They make me go far away from my sanctuary." Not that I'm going away from my sanctuary. They make me go far from my sanctuary. We made this note, and you may have this in the margin of your text, that God and the idols are side by side, and God is saying one of us has to go. We gave the illustration of here's a man and he has his wife, and then he has his girlfriend on the side, and his wife says, one of us has to go. She goes or I go. And that's the way God feels. God views this as adultery. Idolatry is adultery. He's saying that one of us is going to go. Either the idols go out of the temple or I'm going to leave. So go look again at verse 6. That you make me go far from my sanctuary. Well, his going far from the sanctuary happens in chapter 10. That's what we're going to see. So let's start in chapter 9 now. Three things happen in chapter 9. The wicked are slaughtered while the righteous are spared. The righteous are marked and they're spared, verses 1 through 4. So let's make our way through that, and then we'll see some practical things. Then he called in my hearing. Remember, this is still a vision. Anything's possible in a vision. Ezekiel is off in Babylon, but he, in the vision, is in Jerusalem, seeing things going on around the temple. So he said, he called to me in my hearing and said, let those in charge of the city draw near with a deadly weapon in his hand. And suddenly 6 men came from the direction of the gate, which faces north, with a battle axe in his hand. So 6 men showed up, and then there is one that is clothed in linen that's there. Now there's some questions. Some commentators think that the man in linen is one of the 6. I think he's an additional man, and therefore he's a 7th man. And that's not here nor there. I don't think that's going to make any difference in your interpretation of the text. And the reason I say that is because later in the text, the 6 are to go forth killing, but that's not the function of the man dressed in linen. He's to mark those who are righteous. But anyway, be that as it may, look at verse 1. He has a writer's inkhorn on his side. The others had a weapon, a deadly weapon in their hand. They're ready to kill. They're ready to execute judgment. But he has an inkhorn by his side, and they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now you might underline it, verse 3. The glory of God of Israel had gone up from the cherub where it had been to the threshold of the temple. Hadn't left the temple yet. But notice the progression that's taking place. God had said, you're making me leave. But God didn't immediately leave. But there is this progression of moving some and then moving some more and then ultimately departing from the temple and going to the mountain in chapter 10, as we're going to see. But notice again at verse 3, the glory of the Lord had gone up and to the threshold of the temple, and he called the man in the linen cloth who had the writer's horn by his side, and said, go in the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the forehead of the men, and you might underline now, those who sigh and cry over the abominations that are done within it. Now let's stop and talk about 2 or 3 things. One of the things I'm noticing from that is he's marking those that are righteous. And this is in a vision. He's putting a mark on their forehead so that when those who are going forth to slaughter, they know not to kill this one and not kill that one and not kill that one, because they're marked as the righteous. They have a mark on the head. This isn't literally happening, but it's in a vision. Now, Ezekiel, at the end of chapter 11, is going to be retelling all of this later. And there's some validity to this, and you're going to see what gives him that validity in a moment. But what I'm learning from that is that when apostasy occurs, and this is true even today, when apostasy occurs, not all go astray. That Jerusalem is ripe for destruction. Jerusalem is going down the tubes. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, but there's some righteous in the midst of Jerusalem that will be spared. There's a remnant. There always has been and there always will be a remnant. And you see that all through the prophets. So what I'm learning from that is, suppose there's another major apostasy in the church and many people go astray. In fact, most go astray. Not everyone goes astray. If this church goes into apostasy, not everyone in it's going to go into apostasy. Some would turn aside or turn away from that and turn to the Lord. So not everyone goes astray in apostasy. Here's something else I'm learning from verse 4. Notice he didn't say, go mark the righteous. That would be what I would expect. I want you to go through. They're about to slaughter the city of Jerusalem. They're going through with a weapon in their hand to kill. And I want you with the inkhorn by your side. I want you to go through and put a mark on the forehead of every righteous person. That's not how he worded it. Here's how he worded it. Look at the end of verse 4. Those who sigh and cry over the abominations that are done within it. Here's what I'm learning from that. Those who are righteous do sigh and they do cry over the abominations in Israel. In other words, if there is error being taught and there's departure in Israel today, and you're not bothered by that, you might question if you're among the righteous. Because the righteous will be those that sigh and cry over the abominations. So when you see error rising up and people following after that error, and that doesn't bother you, you kind of, well, big deal. Then you might not be those that have the mark on the forehead. We need to be among those that have the mark on the forehead, those who are righteous. But the righteous are described as those who sigh and cry over the abominations in Israel. Well, let's go for the beginning at verse 5. Now the rest, that is the wicked, are going to be utterly destroyed. Let's see that in verses 5 through 7. That in verse 5, to the others he said in my hearing, that is these other 6, I take it. Or if some be correct, the other 5. But the other 6, slay old and young men, maidens and little children and women, and do not come near anyone on whom is the mark. Now, let's stop there for a moment. God's already said he would not have any pity. That's not showing much pity. Because I want you to slay the men and the women, the young and the old and the children even. Why is that? Because the nation is given over to wickedness, and that's part of the consequence of their wickedness. But he says this, begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were before the temple. Now there's something to be learned from that. And I think the significance of that, and you have a question in your handout about that, what's the significance of starting at the sanctuary? And I think starting at the sanctuary, that's where the corruption was. He just saw that in chapter 8. So in the vision, he goes in and he sees they're offering incense unto idols. They're offering sacrifice to the sun gods, and on and on and on. And here were 24 priests representing the priesthood. Remember the corruption they were involved in that we saw in chapter 7 and 8. And what I'm learning from that is that he's saying this is where the problem begins, is in the leadership. So that's where the execution needs to begin. You don't begin out there with everyone else and then maybe get the leaders later. You start with the leaders because these are the ones that led them astray. And these are the ones who are responsible. These are the ones that could have turned the tide, and they didn't. So you start at the sanctuary. And notice verse 7, he said to them, defile the temple and fill the courts with the slain. Go out. Y'all go out and slaughter everybody. Now don't kill those who are righteous. Spare them. But go out and slaughter everybody else and defile the temple. Well, that doesn't sound like what God would say, defile the temple. What he's saying, it's already been defiled. It's already been ruined. It's already been corrupted. Destroy the temple now. And it will be in this third invasion. So now beginning at verse 8, we're ready for Ezekiel's reaction. You see, the righteous have been marked and they're spared and the rest are going to be utterly destroyed. Ezekiel had a reaction to that beginning at verse 8, and he said, I was left alone. And while they were killing me, I was left alone, and I fell on my face and I cried out and I said, Oh Lord God, will you destroy the remnant of Israel and pouring out your fury on Jerusalem? He was so overwhelmed with his vision of the fury going through Jerusalem that, God, are you going to kill everybody? Is there not anybody going to be spared? And then he said to me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah are exceedingly great. Yes, there's great slaughter because there's exceedingly great sin. But then he says, for the Lord says, for they say, the Lord has forsaken the land and the Lord does not see. You might underline that. That was their argument. What was that? I think I had a question on that. Yes, verse 9, what does it mean? Well, here's what I think that means. I think the people were saying, in essence, those in Jerusalem who are corrupt, they're blaming it all on God for the sin they're involved in and for the corruption they're involved in. Because they're saying the Lord has forsaken this land. Evidence? He allowed Nebuchadnezzar to invade it once, take people captive, invade it a second time and keep people captive. And that tells me God's forsook his people. God has forsaken his land. This is God's fault. He turned his back on us. That was their argumentation. Now verse 10. But as for me also, my eye will not spare. In other words, God says to him, no, I'm not killing everybody. We're not going to destroy everybody. There is a remnant, but my eye will not have any pity and I will not spare, and I will recompense their deeds on their own head. And then about that time, as the chapter ends, the man with the inkhorn dressed in linen comes back and says, I have done what you commanded me. In other words, that was God's answer. Those who are righteous and those who are living right have been marked clearly, and they will not be slaughtered. So what's happened in chapter 9? Short chapter, 11 verses. The wicked are slaughtered while the righteous are spared. And so Ezekiel sees that and he's overwhelmed, but he's not through because he's going to be overwhelmed later in these chapters. He's amazed at what's going on. This must have been a moving vision that he saw, and he's going to be telling that a little bit later. All right, let's move to chapter 10 now and see what we see in chapter 10. In chapter 10, what we have is the glory of the Lord departs from the temple. This is where it does depart. Now in chapter 11, we're going to see the threat of judgment and the promise of mercy. And that gets to the end of the book. It gives us a foretaste of what happens at the third section of the book, which was the third section of Isaiah and also the third section of Jeremiah, or at least the last section of all of those books. So let's see what happens here. The coals of fire are spread over Jerusalem. And so he said, I looked, and there was a firmament. And it simply means an expanse. Your footnote will talk about a firmament. We see that in Genesis 1, and that's been a source of great controversy with our critics of the text. And I'm not going to get into that, but it just simply means that there was a great expanse or space above the cherubim. And there appeared something like a sapphire stone having the appearance and the likeness of a throne. And that's the only mention of the throne, but it seems to be later in the chapter a throne chariot that's pictured with these cherubim involved. Now let's stop and footnote just for a moment. Let's go back to chapter 1. You remember in the vision in chapter 1, there were the vision of the four living creatures that we saw. And the four living creatures had four faces, and there was the face of ox, and there was the face of a lion, and so on down the line. That we saw the face of a man, the face of an ox, and the face of a lion, and the face of an eagle. They were not identified in chapter 1 as being cherubim. So we don't know that. We got ahead when we were in chapter 1 and identified them as being cherubim from chapter 10. But here's where we learn. That's what I'm trying to tell you. That we don't know that till we get to chapter 10. And now that we're in chapter 10, we're seeing those creatures in chapter 1, those four living creatures, were cherubim. And so he identifies that here. And I know it's the same one because he says it was the same ones that he saw by the river Kibar in chapter 1. All right. With that in mind, he said, I saw above them this image like a throne above them. Let's stick that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to that. And the voice spoke to the man that had the linen cloth, said, go among the wheels. You remember these four living creatures, the cherubim had wheels. And there were wheels within wheels. We'll get to that in a moment. We ask a question in the handout about that. And he said, go fill your hands with coals of fire among the cherubim and scatter them in the city. And he went as I watched. Ezekiel said, I watched as this went on. He said he was told to go get this, and there he was. All right, let's go on down through verse 8, and then we'll stop and comment upon that. Then verse 3 said, the cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple, and the cloud filled the inner court of the temple, and the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub. So the glory of the Lord's still there, but it's moving. That's what I want you to see. And it was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory. The Lord's presence had filled it with its brightness, and so there was evidence, and at least in the vision, that the Lord is still here in the temple, and the Lord's glory is in this temple, but it's going to leave. God has been saying, I'm going to leave. And the sound of the cherubim was heard in the outer court like the voice of a mighty, almighty God when he speaks. It must have been an overwhelming sound to hear the sound of the cherubim. And he said, when the man who was clothed in linen was commanded, take fire from among the wheels, from among the cherubim, and he went in beside the wheels, and the cherub stretched out his hand and took fire from among the cherubim. Now verse 8 mentions, verse 7 mentions that they took his, and put it in the hands of the man with the linen cloth, and he went out. And then there's a footnote at verse 8, basically, which says that there was under the wings of the cherub, there was something like a man's hand, which of course is possible in a vision. So what we have in verses 1 to 8 is the man with the linen cloth that had marked all those who are righteous. He was told to take these coals of fire from among the cherub and take that and scatter them over Jerusalem. In other words, Jerusalem's going to be burned. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And he sees that in the vision. Now this gives Ezekiel something to tell the people. Now I'm getting excited about that, I guess. So let's get ahead and get on over to the end of chapter 11. Look at chapter 11, verse 25. So I spoke to those in captivity all the things the Lord had shown me. So all this he's seeing about, I saw this man with the inkhorn going and marking those that are righteous. and I saw the men going forth with weapons and slaying, and I saw the man with the linen cloth taking the coals of fire and scattering them over Jerusalem. He's going to tell all of that in vivid color. Now then, I want us to, that gets us down to verse 8. Let's start at verse 9 now. There's the throne chariot of the Lord appears. Now, I say the throne because the throne had been mentioned at verse 1. Above in this expanse, this throne, something like a throne had been seen. So let's start at verse 9. And he said, when I looked, there were 4 wheels by the cherubim. 1 wheel by 1 cherub, and another wheel by each of the other cherub. And the wheels appeared to have color of beryl stone. Now, as for their appearance, they all looked alike, he said. But I want you to notice at verse 10, he talks about this wheel in the middle of a wheel. We saw that in chapter 1. So let's go again and back to this, visit this wheel within a wheel. This is a vision. Anything's possible. It's the idea of a wheel, and then inside of that is a wheel that runs perpendicular to that. In other words, that's impossible to have a wheel that touches the ground inside another wheel. You can have a wheel in a wheel, but not that touches the ground and runs both directions. But it's the idea that anything's possible in a vision. The idea is that it can run this way and this way and this way and this way, showing the omnipresence of God. God is everywhere. He can go forward, he can go back, he can go to the right, he can go to the left. He goes in all directions. And so these cherubim, this throne scene, they can take this throne of God and it's everywhere. And so it has to do with the omnipresence of God, I think. But this is interesting at verse 12 because this gives us information we didn't see in chapter 1. In chapter 1, the eyes were only on the wheels. But in verse 12, and their whole body and their back and their hands and their wings and the wheels, that the forehead were full of eyes all around. Now, that doesn't contradict chapter 1 because chapter 1 didn't say that the eyes were only on the wheels. It just said the eyes were all around the wheels. But here it seems there are eyes all over. The omniscience of God, I think, is being emphasized. So in this vision, here is the all-seeing God who sees and knows everything and is everywhere, is the one dealing with this nation and dealing with Jerusalem. Now, verse 13 is quite interesting. As for the wheels, they are called in my hearing, I'm reading from the New King James, they're called in my hearing wheels. You say, well, yeah. I think there's another translation going to help us with that. Several translations. In fact, several translations say whirling wheels. Now that makes more sense. Obviously the wheels are wheels, but these are whirling wheels. These are rolling wheels. These are moving wheels. That's the idea. That's what the word literally means. It's the idea of whirling wheels. It's the idea that God's glory is about to whirl out of the temple. So here's get the picture of this throne scene. As the coals have been scattered over Jerusalem, in this throne scene, he said, I saw these cherubim, and it was like they had wheels, and a wheel within a wheel, so that it went in all directions. And I saw eyes all over them, and I saw this throne above, and I saw the glory of God ascending up above, and then I heard a voice that said, these are whirling wheels. These wheels are on the move. The glory of God is about to whirl out of the temple. It's going to be gone. And that it does here by the time we get to verse 18. Now, beginning at verse 14, we're still in this throne scene here. We have, again, something quite interesting that varies from chapter 1. That each of the 4 faces, the first face was that of a cherub. And the second was of a man, and the third face was like a lion, and the fourth was like an eagle. Now drop down to verse 22. The likeness of their faces was the same as the faces which I had seen by the river Kibar. So he's saying this is the same thing I saw over in chapter 1. Where's the ox? The ox wasn't mentioned. Several explanations have been given, none of which seem to make a lot of sense to me. And so I'm going to leave it at this. Ezekiel changed the face of the ox to the face of the cherub. Why? I don't know. I don't know. For some reason, he did that. I don't know of a good explanation of that. For some reason, he did. And I'm going to leave it at that. And if you figure that out, you can let me know. But there is, and you say, well, I think these are different cherubs. Verse 22 says they're the same. For some reason, he did. Maybe he thought that the cherub was like unto the ox of the strength and the service. Maybe that's the point he's trying to make. And so the cherub were lifted up, verse 15, I'm sorry. And there was the living creature that I saw by the river Kidron. These are the living creatures I saw. These are the same ones. And when the cherub went, the wheels went beside them, and the cherub lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth, and the same wheels were beside them. In other words, wherever the cherub went, the wheels went, and wherever the wheels went, the cherub went. And I saw them lifted up. Now something's about to happen here. And the key verse is verse 18 now, as we start the next section. So the throne, in other words, all we saw in 9 through 11 was, it's like the throne of God had appeared in this, above the cherub. There was something like a throne above, like a sapphire stone, and it was like a throne. And then here was the cherub with the wheels that went in every direction and eyes all around. And I saw the glory of God rising up. Now verse 18. You might underline. Then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple. If you don't mark that one, you're missing a good opportunity to circle or mark or underline or highlight the verse that's the key to the whole section. This is what this whole chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11 are about. So when we get through, you say, I didn't understand some of the stuff about the eyes and the wheels and the wheel within a wheel. What was this all about? This verse, verse 18, is the key to what this is all about. That the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood above the cherub. And they lifted up their wings and they mounted up from the earth. And when they went out, the wheels went beside them. And the glory of the Lord of Israel was above them. So in other words, they're lifting the glory of the Lord and they're carrying it out. They're being ushered out in this chariot scene. Now let's finish that chapter. This was the living creature that I saw under God by the river Kidron when I was, and I knew they were cherubim. In other words, these are the same ones I saw over in chapter 1. And the likeness was the same as the likeness of the faces, and each went straight forward. I mean, in other words, with the four faces, in any direction they're moving forward. They're never going backwards. So whether they're going this direction, or they're going in this direction, or this direction, or that direction, they're going straight forward. Again, emphasizing, I think, the omnipresence of God. And so the glory of the Lord is departing from the temple. It's lifted up. That's the key. All right, let's go to chapter 11 now and work our way through some things in chapter 11. And then we'll get to some practical things, hopefully, that we learn, as well as working that along as we go through. All right, here's chapter 11 now. I have just, it's a little long. This is the longest of the chapters. But this has to do with the threat of judgment and the promise of mercy. Now, let's talk about the threat of judgment. This begins with the leaders. So the rebellious leaders, the rulers, are threatened, verses 1 to 13. Now, I think that's part of the significance of starting at the sanctuary in chapter 9. You start at the sanctuary as you're going through with your slaying instrument to slay the men. So the Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the east gate of the Lord's house, which faces eastward. At the door of the gate, and 25 men, and among them, and he mentions two. There's Jazaniah. You say, I've seen him before. Probably not the same one, because they have different fathers. Unless we can identify those two men as being the same men. But I mean, the fathers by different names. But I think the general thought is that these are not the same men. And then there's another one, Pelatiah. He was a prince of the people, the son of Benaiah, prince of the people, Pelatiah. Well, he's going to be significant to an event here that we're going to see if you haven't read ahead. Now let's see what happens to them. He said to me, Son of man, these are the men who devise iniquity and give wicked counsel to the city. We're going to deal with them. These are the ones that give wicked counsel to the city. Well, what are they saying to the city? Well, we're going to see part of their argument here. These were the kinds of people that are these were saying the kinds of things we've talked about in the book of Jeremiah, particularly. The city's not going to fall. Jerusalem's going to be spared. Jeremiah's all wet about this thing about Jerusalem falling. There is not going to be, the temple will never be destroyed. We're safe, peace, peace, when there was no peace. So he says at verse 3, they say the time is not near to build houses. This city is the cauldron and we are the meat. Now that's perhaps confusing on the surface. Time is not near to build houses. In other words, their argument is the city is safe. It's not going to fall. Nebuchadnezzar is not coming like the prophets are saying. Even if he does come, the city is not going to be taken. And so perhaps some are thinking that the city is going to be destroyed and we'll have to rebuild after the city is destroyed. It's not time for that, and there's not going to be time for that. We're not going to do that because we're not going to be rebuilding. And here's why. Because the city is the cauldron or the pot, and we are the meat. As the cauldron protects the meat from the fire, so we'll be protected from the fire of punishment. In other words, we are the meat that's being protected from the invading army. This city is going to protect us. The walls of the city are going to protect us. We are protected. And it's not going to happen. That was the same kind of argument that's already been made time and again. And so the city is the cauldron and we are the meat. So God tells him, you prophesy, son of man, and then he says, the Spirit of the Lord fell on me. Might make a marginal note. That's an affirmation of inspiration. Now, if he wasn't speaking by the Spirit of the Lord, he lied. And so he's a liar if he's not inspired. So it's not that Ezekiel was a good man and he was just, no, he's either inspired or he's a liar, one or the other. I take it that he's inspired. The Spirit of the Lord fell upon him and he told him to speak. And here's what you're going to say, O house of Israel, I know the things that come into your mind. Now let's tie that with what we saw earlier. The all-seeing eyes of God, I think with the eyes being on all the wheels as they move in the whirling wheels and on the body of the cherubim, etc., and on their wings, etc., suggests God has the all-seeing eye. And God knows, go back to verse 5, God says to the house of Israel, I know the things that come to your mind. If I know what comes in your mind, I know what you do, and I know your actions. I know your thoughts. I know your reasoning. I know the intents of your heart. That's kind of startling. They might underline it, verse 6. You have multiplied the slain in this city and filled the streets with the slain. How did they do that? These were the false prophets. These were the priests that had misled. And the text says, you have multiplied the slain in the city. Were they literally killing them? No. But what it's saying is, by encouraging the people to rebel against God, they were increasing the number of slain. Perhaps we could say the same thing about us, some of us today at least, that you are sending people to hell. What do you mean I'm sending people to hell? When I'm encouraging them in the wrong direction, I'm multiplying the number of people in hell is what I'm doing. And that's what he's saying to them. He's saying you are multiplying the slain. Those that are being killed, you leaders who misled and misprophesied are responsible for all the slain. You're multiplying the number of the slain. You're the ones that misled them. And that's why judgment's beginning here. Now notice at verse 7. He said, your slain whom you have laid in the midst, they are the meat and the city is the cauldron, and I'll bring them out of the midst. Well, what you're picturing is that y'all are in the cauldron, that is, y'all are in the pot, and y'all are protected. I'm going to pull you out of that pot. And here's what I'm going to do with you. You have feared the sword, and I'll bring the sword on you. Now, verse 9, and I will bring you out of the midst and deliver you in the hands of strangers. Who on earth is the strangers? You've got a question in your handout about the strangers. That's the Gentiles. That's Babylon. I'm going to turn you over to the hands of Babylon. I'm going to turn you over to strangers. You're fearful of the sword and you're afraid of the sword, but I'm going to tell you the sword's coming and it's going to be from Babylon. I'm going to turn you over to the hands of strangers. And you shall fall by the sword, verse 10, and judge you at the border. And then, here's our phrase, we haven't seen it in a while, then shall you know that I'm the Lord. Might underline that. He's about to say it again, verse 12 in a moment. But before we get to verse 12, you're going to know that I'm the Lord. Then notice at verse 11, the city shall not be your cauldron, nor shall you be the meat in the midst. I will judge you at the border of Israel. What's that saying? You're not going to be protected like you thought. In other words, the city, the people in Jerusalem thought, we're protected. We're the meat that's in the cauldron. We're protected from the fire. We're not going to be bothered at all. And he said, oh, no. I'm pulling you out of the cauldron, but I'm going to tell you, you're not in the cauldron to start with because you're not protected, and I will judge you at the border of Israel. You're going to face your judgment. That's what's going to happen. And now, verse 12, you might underline and mark, and you shall know that I am the Lord. There again. That's two of the 63 times it's mentioned in the book of Ezekiel. For you have not walked in my statutes and executed my judgments, but you have done according to the customs of the Gentiles all around you. Well, there's a lesson there about influence. You see, you've allowed the nations around you to influence, and you became like them. You didn't walk according to my commandments, but you walked according to the influence of the Gentiles. I'm going to let you go among the Gentiles. Now then, verse 13. I said we'd come back to this, to Pelatiah. That while I was prophesying that Pelatiah, the son of Benaiah, died, and I fell on my face and I cried, and we'll come back to what his question was in a moment. But what's the significance of that? That's not just an oh, by the way thing. That this is kind of an interesting historical thing. But he died over in Jerusalem, and Ezekiel's over here in Babylon. And while he was prophesying about these leaders, at that very moment, Pelatiah died. So what's the significance of that? That when Ezekiel begins to tell that and word gets out about that and they begin to hear, they got word eventually. It may be by the Pony Express, but it takes a while for the word to come. But when the word comes, at the timing of that brings validity to the message of Ezekiel. Now, I want to get ahead of myself to verse 25 again. He told all these things to the captives. And he goes and tells them, here's what I just saw, a vision of God. God gave me this vision, and I saw all of this, and here's what I saw. And I saw in this vision Pelatiah dying at that very moment. Okay, that might not register much, but then when they get word and start asking people about things that they begin to realize, you know what? That really did happen. He did die over there in Jerusalem. And that brings validity to his vision. His vision message is validated by that. And that's going to give some credibility to him. So then he fell on his face at verse 13 and he cried out with a question. And now that's going to bring us to the rest of the chapter. And the question was, will you make a complete end of the remnant of Israel? That's been bothering Ezekiel all through this vision. Does this mean then that you're going to bring an end to the remnant? You're going to just wipe Israel out completely? Is that what you're going to do? If two of us have already come into captivity, two groups of people come into captivity, and there's going to be the fall of Jerusalem, is this going to be a complete collapse in the sense that they're all gone? There's not even going to be a remnant. And God's answer to that's no. No, that's not the case. So let's start now at verse 14. A remnant shall be gathered out of the nations. Now, this is the first time we've seen this in Ezekiel. It's not the first time we've ever seen it. First time we've seen it in Ezekiel. So this is one of those first. And you've got a question about this. Let's get what he's saying here, beginning at verse 14. The word of the Lord came to him again. Son of man, your brethren, your relatives, your kinsmen, and all the house of Israel in its entirety are those about whom the inhabitants of Jerusalem have said, get far away from the Lord. Now that's strange wording. For this land has been given to us for a possession. Now go back and read that again. Make sure you understand what he's saying. What he's saying is that those who were left in Jerusalem were making this argument. They were making this statement. What were they saying? They were saying to the inhabitants, to other inhabitants, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have said, get far away from the Lord. In other words, those who have gone into captivity, those who went in the first captivity, those who went in the second group, y'all go away from the Lord. We're staying here because those left in Jerusalem are protected. This land was given to us for a possession. So the idea is that the exiles deserve what they deserve, but we are protected. Y'all deserve to be punished. Y'all go from the Lord. Go on. Get out of here. Go to another land. But we're going to stay here because we're protected. This isn't going to happen like the prophet said. And God said this, although I've cast them far among the Gentiles and I've scattered them among the countries, yet I have a little sanctuary from them in the countries where they've gone. In other words, it's as if God had set up sanctuaries everywhere in the other nations. He literally didn't, but it's as if he did, because he's sparing his people. And he said at verse 17, now this is the first promise of a restoration in the book. If that means any significance of historical significance to you, this is the first time that this is promised. At verse 17, I will gather the people and assemble them from the countries where you have scattered, and I will give them the land of Israel. Now I want to take just a moment and go back here to our outline. That's what 33 to 48 is going to be about. He's pointing to that. That's what that's all about, is he's going to be pointing to this whole concept of the restoration and the remnant. Now then, at verse 18, and they shall go from there and shall take away, before I read verses 18 and 19, here's the point. In the day they return, they're going to be changed. This perhaps is blending in to the days of the Messiah. This sounds so much like Jeremiah 31 to me. But they're going to be changed. They're going to go from there and they'll take away all the detestable things, and I will give them a new heart and I'll put a new spirit within them, and their stony heart will out of their, I'll make and take the stony heart out of their flesh and give them a heart of flesh. And when they walk by my statutes and my judgments, I will be their God and they shall be my people. That has to have some messianic significance in this restoration period. But there's going to be a period of restoration and ultimate restoration in the Messiah. Has to be. Now then, let's finish the chapter. Our time is almost gone. Then at verse 21, let's start at verse 22. The cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels. Now remember, this is taking place in increments. The glory of the Lord had been lifted up. Then the cherubim moved, and the glory moved with it, but it hadn't gone from the temple yet. Till now, verse 22. They lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was high above them. Now, verse 23, mark. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain, which is on the east side of the city. The glory is now gone. The glory is now departed. Let's go back to chapter 8. We've got time to do this. Chapter 8 and verse 6. You make me go far from my sanctuary. You make me do that. You drove me to this. The glory is now gone. And then he said, the Spirit took me and brought me by the Spirit of God to the Chaldea, to those in captivity. And then he says, I spoke to those in captivity all the things the Lord had shown me. What a message that must have been. Wouldn't you love to have been there and heard Ezekiel tell this himself? Let me tell you what I saw. I saw this vision. Saw these cherubim, and here's what it looked like. Well, you've heard him tell it because you've read the text, and that's exactly what he's done. The wicked are slaughtered. So here's the glory departing. When the idolatry was seen, God said, I want the wicked to be slaughtered. I want the righteous to be spared. The glory of the Lord is going to depart from the temple, and I saw this throne scene, and then next thing I see is the glory is gone. And so because of their sin, because of their corruption, the glory is departed from Israel. And from the temple particularly. Well, I wanted to say a little more about some practical things. Our time is gone. We'll stop there, and we'll pick up with chapter 12 next time.